The first scary story. With each blow of rain, drops of water drummed on the glass of the window, creating a monotonous rhythm that seemed to carry me into the abyss of an endless sleep. But that night, the dream turned out to be far away, because I heard a knock. The first knock was barely audible, as if someone had tapped a finger on the glass. I lifted my head from the pillow and looked around. The room was dark, but there was a moon outside the window, and I saw the outlines of objects. Not noticing anything unusual, I decided that it was just the wind playing with the window shutters. However, soon after the first knock, others followed. They became clearer and more regular, as if something was knocking on the window with their hands. My heart began to beat faster, and I felt a chill seep into my bones. I looked back at the window, and there, in the light of the moon, I saw them. The entities were ancient and gloomy, with dark hoods hiding their faces. Their arms were thin and long, with fingers topped with long claws. They stood in the darkness outside my window, and their endless eyes looked at me as if they were piercing my soul. The knocking became even louder and more insistent, and the entities began to whisper unintelligible words that I could not understand. I was afraid to move, afraid to even blink, as if that might attract their attention even more. My room filled with cold, and I felt that the entities were approaching the window. They became more aggressive, knocking on the glass with frantic force, and their whispers penetrated my ears, making me dizzy. And then I made up my mind. I got out of bed and, clutching my lamp in my hand, slowly walked to the window. The entities continued to knock and whisper, but they could not enter until I touched the glass. The lamp illuminated their faces, and I saw that they were only a reflection of my fear. They disappeared like smoke, and the knocking stopped. From that night, I no longer heard the knocking on the window, but the memory of those creatures remained with me. Sometimes, when the night becomes dark and gloomy, I can still feel their presence, secretly waiting in the darkness behind the glass. Several weeks have passed since that terrible night. I tried to convince myself that seeing the creatures was just a result of stress or fatigue, but every night when I went to bed, the fear took over me again. At first, I tried to avoid looking at the window at night. Then I closed the curtains and put up heavy curtains, but even that didn't help. The creatures returned, and their knocking became louder and more insistent, as if they were determined to return to me. I began to spend sleepless nights trying to find an explanation for these terrible visits. A single lamp illuminated my room, and I noticed something strange. The knocking always began when the moon was at its highest peak in the sky. It was as if entities were coming from another world at the moment when the night was at its darkest. However, one day I decided to do something I had never done before. I took my camera and decided to try to photograph these creatures. Night came, and, as expected, the knocking began. I carefully opened the curtains and turned on the camera. The entities were there, as always, knocking on the glass of the window and whispering their unintelligible words. I pressed a button on the camera, and in the darkness their silhouettes were reflected on the screen. But when I brought the camera closer to the window, something strange happened. Through the camera lens, I saw not entities, but something else. Some signs and symbols sparkling on the surface of the glass. They were written in blood or something that looked like it, and they seemed ancient and mystical. My camera began to distort, and the image turned into something distorted and scary. The next thing I remembered is losing consciousness. I woke up in the morning, clutching the camera to myself, but there was no photograph of the creatures. But I knew that something had happened, something connected with these terrible creatures and mysterious symbols. Since then, I have not seen these creatures again, but the mystery still remains unsolved. Maybe it was a dream, an illusion, or something else, but I am left with these strange memories that remind me that the world is full of secrets and unknown forces. Second story. The night it all started, I was sitting in my room, absorbed in reading a book. The gloomy atmosphere of the old house in which I lived created a special aura, and it always seemed to me that many secrets were hidden here. However, the night brought something unusual that I could not describe in words. The light from my desk lamp began to flicker and the room began to shake. I looked up from the book and stared at the mirror hanging on the wall opposite. At first glance, there was something strange in the mirror. There, in the reflection of my room, I saw movement, as if someone was standing behind me. But when I turned around, no one was there. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking maybe it was my nerves. Returning my gaze to the book, I continued reading, hoping to forget about this strange moment. However, after a while, I felt something strange again. It was a whisper. It was quiet and barely audible, as if someone was whispering something very close by, but the words were unclear. I looked at the mirror and saw that my reflection was whispering something that I could not understand. "Who are you?" I asked, looking at my reflection. But there was no answer, only the whisper continued, becoming more insistent and more mysterious. I stood up and approached the mirror. My reflection looked back at me with dark, restless eyes. I tried to touch the glass, but my hand went through it, as if the mirror was just an illusion. "What do you want?" I shouted, but there was no answer. Only the whisper became louder, as if inviting me into its world of mysterious sounds. I turned away from the mirror and decided to leave the room, but the whispers followed me. It began to sound everywhere, in every mirror, in every reflection. I couldn't handle him anymore. As time passed, the whisper became a restless noise, and I felt it begin to penetrate my thoughts. He began to repeat words that were unfamiliar to me, but which seemed infinitely important. The world around me became distorted, and I plunged into something unknown, where whispers were all that remained of reality. I was a prisoner of my own thoughts, locked in a world where mirrors became windows into the unknown, and whispers became my guide in the darkness. Since then, I have never returned to that room. The mirror remains on the wall, but I avoid it, afraid to hear that mysterious whisper again. My life has changed, but in my nightmares I still hear his words, words that I could never understand, but that remain with me like a curse from a mirror. Days turned into months, and months into years, but that strange whisper from the mirror never left my memory. He was always there, like an obsessive shadow, waiting to come back into my life at any moment. I moved out of the old house and even changed the furnishings, but nothing helped. My mind was permeated by that mystical power, and I became convinced that my only way out lay in the answers and clues to the mysterious whispers of the mirrors. I decided to take a step that seemed crazy. I began to examine the mirror more closely. One dark evening, by candlelight and knife in hand, I began to carve symbols and designs that seemed familiar to me. They were similar to the ones I saw in the reflection the night it all started. My room was filled with candlelight and strange sounds that appeared when the knife touched the mirror. My process continued for weeks, perhaps months, and at some point I felt the whispering getting stronger. He no longer seemed like a mystery, but rather an answer to my efforts. The whisper became a clear spoken word, and I realized it was a message. "Free us," whispered the mirror. My heart froze. I didn't know what that could mean. "The moment will come when our world will collide with yours," the whisper continued. "And then we need someone to be ready, to free us." I realized that I was faced with a choice. I could give it all up and put the mirror away, forgetting about the nights spent in fear, or I could move on and try to understand what was behind this mystery. I made a decision. I'll be ready when that moment comes. I don't know what these entities are or where they came from, but I understand that they are part of a world about which we know nothing, and my world is their world. My life now serves one purpose: to prepare for what is to come and to remain true to the mystery begun by the whisper from the mirror. Third story. Working in that psychiatric hospital was my first serious experience of medical practice. When I first started my career, I was full of enthusiasm and desire to help patients, but what I saw and experienced in that place left a deep scar on me. The hospital stood in the middle of a dense forest, far from civilization. It was old and gloomy, like a home for lost souls. Many of the patients were deeply affected and ended up here after serious mental turmoil. There was a strange atmosphere in the hospital, as if time had stopped here. But from the very beginning, I was struck by the unusual atmosphere of the place. There were too many secrets and mysteries in the hospital. Patients sometimes disappeared, and their disappearances were explained by some random circumstances. But I felt that this was no accident. The first case of disappearance occurred a few weeks after my arrival. A patient named Maria, with whom I had conversations and whom I tried to help, simply disappeared from her cell. The door was locked from the inside. The window was closed, but she simply disappeared. We were unable to find Maria. Not her body, not any evidence. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. I began to feel trembling and restless inside, and this was just the beginning. Cases of disappearances began to occur too often. Patients, being in closed rooms under constant surveillance, simply disappeared without a trace. The investigation looked for answers, but found nothing. I felt like there was some kind of sinister plot going on. The nights in the hospital were especially scary. Sounds from dark corridors, shuffling and whispering that could not be explained. Sometimes I heard my name, which filled me with horror. It was probably the result of constant stress and anxiety, but sometimes it seemed to me that the hospital lived its own life, and we were just its hostages. I decided to do my own investigation, but the deeper I dug, the scarier it became. In the documents, I found records of secret research and unusual experiments on patients. It was as if the hospital was hiding something ancient and sinister. At night, I heard footsteps in the corridor and heavy breathing behind me. Turning around, I saw a shadow that quickly disappeared. My heart was pounding. I realized that the hospital was keeping a secret that it did not want to reveal, and that I could be the next victim. I managed to escape from this place of nightmare. And now, even after the years that have passed since then, I still cannot forget those terrible days and nights. I don't know what the mental hospital is hiding, but I'm sure it's something sinister and forgotten. After I escaped from the mental hospital, I decided not to go to the police because, frankly, I didn't believe that they could help me. I felt like an outlaw, like everyone in this hospital was part of some ancient mystery, and I knew I couldn't trust anyone. However, fear and ignorance led me to begin my own investigation. I began to study the history of the hospital and the records that I took with me. This was my way of finding at least some answers to the questions that tormented me. During my investigation, I discovered that the hospital had been in existence for decades and had been the site of many strange disappearances throughout its history. It looks like this was more than just a coincidence. The deeper I dug, the darker details began to emerge. The notes contained references to certain experiments conducted on patients, experiments that most certainly led to their extinction. I began to find out the names of the people responsible for these studies and tried to find connections to other similar incidents in other places. I soon came across references to a mysterious organization known as Shadow Research. It was a secret group engaged in research and experimentation in the fields of psychiatry and psychology. Their goals and methods were found in great mystery, and then I had a revelation that made me tremble. I found a connection between shadow studies and the mental hospital I worked at. It was as if this organization was looking for a suitable place for its experiments, and this place became a hospital in which patients disappeared without a trace. I decided that it was necessary to reveal this horror and bring it to the general public. But it was an incredibly dangerous undertaking. I knew that Shadow Research would stop at nothing to protect its secrets. My life turned into running and fighting for the truth. I hid, crossing cities and countries, trying to stay away from those who were pursuing me. But fear and danger were always there, like ghosts that haunted me. Every day I came closer to solving a riddle that seemed incomprehensible and terrible. My life was on the edge, but I couldn't stop because the mystery of the hospital and Shadow Research had become a part of me, and I couldn't leave it unsolved. Fourth story. I was a courier at one of the oldest and most mysterious pizzerias in the city. Let's call it Dark Pizza. This job was unusual, but it promised good money, and I agreed. One evening, As darkness began to descend on the city streets, I received an order for delivery to a secluded area on the outskirts. The customer, Mr. Smith, asked to have pizza delivered to his house. There was nothing unusual in the instructions, just an address and instructions to leave the pizza at the door and don't expect a tip. Everything looked ordinary, but something about this order made me feel something was wrong. When I arrived at the address, I was struck by darkness. All the street lights were turned off, and the wind howled through the dark alleys. Mr. Smith's house seemed old and abandoned, as if it had not been visited in decades. Ancient trees surrounded the building, and leaves rustled under footsteps. I carefully approached the door and knocked. No one answered. Figuring Mr. Smith might have already left, I left the pizza by the door as instructed. But at the last moment, when I turned, I heard a strange rustling behind me. Turning around, I saw a shadow moving in the darkness. She was approaching me faster and faster, and my heartbeat increased. I tried to see what kind of creature it was, but it remained in the shadows. As the shadow approached, I saw its outline. It was something completely unthinkable, a mixture of man and animal, with dark eyes sparkling in the darkness. It let out a high-pitched screech that made me scream and run to my car. I ran away from this ominous place as quickly as I could and never returned to that part of the city. I later learned that dark pizza was associated with Mr. Smith and that his house was the site of dark rituals. But the worst thing about this story was that Mr. Smith and his creature remained invisible and undetected. It was something I could never forget. Several weeks had passed since that frightening night, but the nightmare images still haunted me. I decided to inquire in the area about Mr. Smith and his house. Rumors said that he was a certain member of a mysterious sect that practiced strange rituals and human sacrifices. While investigating further, I came across a story about missing people who lived near Mr. Smith's home. These were cases that no one could explain, and local authorities did not pay attention to them. The victims included both local residents and incredibly brave couriers who dared to deliver food to the area. One day, while I was carefully studying the information, I received a new order in the mail from an anonymous client. The address was the same as Mr. Smith's, but nothing else was given. My friends advised me not to take this order, but I decided that I could solve the missing mysteries. The order was for late evening, and darkness had already shrouded the streets when I arrived at the house. Once again, everything was quiet and abandoned, but my doubts were strengthened. I didn't want to return to this nightmare, but something forced me to go forward. As I walked up to the door, it suddenly swung open, and Mr. Smith stood in front of me. He was dressed in black and masked his face with a hood. I felt the coldness coming from him, and my breath froze. "Please come in," he said, his voice sounding like the creaking of old doors. I refused and tried to run away, but at that moment something heavy hit me in the back, and the world was distorted before my eyes. When I woke up, I found myself tied up and surrounded by dark walls. Mr. Smith stood in front of me, holding a knife in his hand. "You are now part of our family," he said with a smile, and my consciousness slowly began to fade as I realized that the terrible rumors about Mr. Smith and his cult were true. I never saw the light of day again, and my story became yet another mystery involving dark pizza and Mr. Smith.